You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. This week, I'm joined by author, investigator, and researcher Preston Dennett to look into some of the strange and unusual cases that feature in his latest book in the Not From Here series. The books collect some of the more peculiar aspects of ufology, and this particular edition includes chapters featuring sitcom episodes that feature UFOs, to those experiencers who receive a warning, as well as some deeply concerning cases featuring man's best friend. But before we join Preston, of course, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/mysteriesandmonsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. You can also click the link in the show notes as usual. Thank you to Daniel, my latest patron, and thank you as always to each and every one of you that continue to support me and the show. Mysteries and Monsters is across all social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit the mysteriesandmonsters.com website for your episodes and news. And don't forget you can also visit our new merchandise store through TeePublic by clicking the link in the show notes. And thank you to each and every one of you that has purchased something recently. Our intro and outro music is by the marvellous Weary Pines. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. Now, let's join Preston Dennett to uncover some rather strange UFO cases. Continuing to chronicle the more unusual aspects of the UFO phenomena, I'm delighted to welcome back researcher and author Preston Dennett in his latest collection in the Not From Here series. Preston looks at some intriguing, peculiar, and in some cases horrifying encounters that people have had with odd visitors. Preston, welcome back to Mysteries and Monsters. How are we?
We're doing pretty good. Can't complain. I will anyway, but no, overall, pretty good.
Well, it's the thought that counts, Preston. You might as well give it a try, hadn't you?
Yeah, I'm having fun, so.
Well, as I said in the introduction, you've released another phenomenal collection of very odd and unusual and strange encounters in the Not From Here series that once again saw it fly to the top of the charts. You seem to be building a real reputation for collating these unusual encounters, and people seem to love them, Preston.
Well, it is one of the things I think, is kind of my specialty, looking for patterns, exploring the darker, unexplored avenues of UFO research. And I've gotten a lot better learning how to do research over the years. I've got a huge collection of UFO magazines and journals and really a lot of books, as you might expect. Interviewed a lot of people. So I'm having a lot of fun, finding these kind of obscure cases and discovering these new patterns and areas that haven't gotten a lot of attention, I guess you might say, because this subject is endlessly fascinating. As you know, there's rabbit holes and, alleyways and all kinds of different ways you can go with this. I mean, it's just layers and layers to it.
I suppose for me, Preston, when I look at your Not From Here collections, and I know as we've spoken before about you collecting certain cases, when you're dealing with odder encounters as featured in this book and others previously in the series, do you have a filing system where you might get, as we'll discuss later in this particular conversation, an encounter that features somebody's dog being involved, and then you think, I wonder if I'll ever come across a case like that again? Because some of the cases that you've covered in previous books and some of the ones in here are so odd and so singular that I would be surprised, even for someone as diligent and as experienced as yourself, Preston, that you would have a folder saying aliens try to kidnap dog, for example.
Right. Well, it is funny because I'll hear an account that's really unusual, that captures my interest. And then later on, it can be, anywhere from a day or a week or years even. And I'll hear another one. And, it's funny. I don't have a great memory for movies, perhaps. if it's a good movie, I'll remember it, but usually it'll take me 2 or 3 times to even remember how it ends. But when it comes to this subject, for whatever reason, I can remember it really well. And yeah, I will sometimes, create a little folder on my computer, like this is a case that I want to remember. And so I'll just lock it in there and kind of remember a keyword, because thank God for the search engine that you can just pull up, just about anything using sort of a word search feature. But yeah, I'm really proud of how I'm able to go back and I remember where I read this. I remember this and know where to find it. There's something about this subject that fascinates me. And as you know, if you're super interested in something, it's a lot easier to remember it.
Yeah. It's weird how the brain works, as you say, Preston, sometimes, that you can read something or see something and it just washes over you. But like you say, there are strange things or weird encounters that your brain just seems to envelope it, and then something else 2-3 years down the line will come along and you go, oh, that reminds me of this particular case from, I don't know, from San Diego that featured a man who saw a moon-shaped craft in the sky. I wonder if there's any similarities here. And it's that kind of, like you say, I think when you've got a passion for something, it's just easy. I don't know if the brain works better when you're dealing with subjects you love, regardless of what field it's in, Preston. It seems to absorb things a lot easier, it would seem, doesn't it?
It's funny because sometimes I'll even remember what the page looked like in a book. I'm like, I know it's on the lower right side or something like that. I think it's one of these books. And sometimes I go on a mad search. I'm like, I know I have this somewhere. And, I'm like a dog with a bone. I will keep looking until I find it. It's fun. It's like digging for treasure in a weird way. Like, here's another one. I found it. And then when you can start to collate a bunch of different accounts and get these patterns, that provides some, hopefully, profound insight into the nature of what's going on here. I mean, that makes it all worth it.
Yeah. I suppose as well, is this, when you've pulled the previous volumes of this series together, Preston, have you noticed any consistent high strangeness cases that continue to be reported in these books? Or is it every time you've come to it, you found that you're dealing with different topics, even though they're all under that ufological umbrella, but there are, as we've said earlier, one of your clear loves of this particular phenomenon is the high strangeness case.
Yeah, well, there's definitely some bleed through with these cases. I'll be exploring a certain subject and, another weird aspect will pop up. I'm like, well, this is interesting. So there's kind of a weird chain that leads you down different avenues. Which is awesome. Sometimes it's just one person, like Betty Andreasen. She's a pretty well-known contactee. She's featured in various chapters throughout the Not From Here series because her experiences are so extensive that I'm like, okay, she's got a lot to share, a lot of experiences. So I see that turning up. But yeah, sometimes I'll, there's a chapter in this book about ET names.
Yes.
That sort of kept coming up because I would run across these in other cases. I'm like, well, gosh, they do have names. This shows a whole sort of really human aspect to them. And the more I thought about it, I'm like, this hasn't really been explored in any depth. There's a few people who did talk about it here and there, but I thought it was, unknown enough that it would be worth a deeper look. And it was surprising. Yeah, it was kind of fun to wow, these are some unusual names and some are very much like ours. But yeah, it's fun looking into these cases and seeing what we can learn from them about who the ETs are, why they're here, what they're doing, where they come from, their agenda on our planet. And frankly, we learn as much about them as we do about us, how we react to these experiences and how it profoundly affects us on so many levels.
Well, that's always a key aspect of this, because often I think in any walk of life, Preston, we can sometimes consider how we would react when we see something incredibly strange or incredibly shocking even. And often some of us will say, oh, well, I would deal with it in this kind of manner, or I wouldn't be like that. But I think, as with anything in life, you don't know how you're going to react until you're involved in something strange. And so sometimes I'm taken aback a little when you read reports from people and they seem very calm and seem to be taking everything in their stride. And then I know, obviously, we've spoken about in previous episodes when we were looking at UFOs over drive-ins and some of the cases that we were dealing there, and some of the other witnesses have bodily reactions to them. You know, the one poor lady who unfortunately wet herself, she was that scared, as we laughed about at the time, because of the planet Venus, as the official explanation was given, which every time I see it in the night sky now, Preston, a smile crosses my face, because I always think of our conversations and thinking, how on earth could anybody put that forward as a reasonable explanation for some of these people's experience?
Yeah, it's shocking. Well, that's Project Blue Book for you. That's our government. They'll put forth any ridiculous debunking explanation because, you know, the cover-up is a real thing. It's no joke. They will bend over backwards to make witnesses look like fools and idiots and hallucinating and what have you. Anything but the truth.
Well, that's obviously still in play, because we can see the way that they've been dancing around the congressional hearings over the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, some of the witnesses and people that have been questioned by the committee, some of the answers that they give are the kind of thing you would see in a court case. It's just complete legalese, and could you rephrase that? I'm not really sure what you know, just basic questions that they're being asked that they just bat away as though they're being asked to describe things in Latin.
Dad always called that polysyllabic circumlocution. Basically, a way of saying a lot of things without saying anything. And they're experts at it. It's like listening to it, it's almost gobbledygook.
Yeah.
It's like, just get to the point. Tell the truth. It's not hard to do.
Well, we would say that, but clearly it's been an issue for several decades now, Preston.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. But I'm glad to see there is progress being made in terms of, I mean, I think we do have a good handle on what's going on here from a researcher and contactee angle. I don't trust the governments and any of the information that's coming out from, you know, the highest levels of the military and the Pentagon and the secret government. Call it what you want. It's clear to me they know a lot more than they're publicly saying. But if you look at the first-hand accounts from the contactees, I think we've got a really good handle on exactly why they're here, why people are being pulled on board, what happens to them, and so forth. And certainly, you know, we don't need our governments to have disclosure. Disclosure, in effect, has already happened. I mean, I look at it this way. How many documented cases is it going to take before this is accepted? Because we're approaching close to 1 million. If you were to look at all the countries and all the databases and all the books and every documented encounter out there, it's well over several 100,000. So disclosure has, in effect, already taken place.
Oh, definitely. But it's I suppose it's quite frustrating as well for anybody well-versed or interested in this topic, Preston. I think most people with a bit of experience in the UFO field would look and see what's being discussed and talked about in regards to the congressional hearings, and they would probably be confused as to why it's such a narrow scope of discussion, because I think we mentioned this last time. The word abductee or experiencer just hasn't been touched upon at all. It's, as far as it seems to be concerned, they just want to talk about a specific type of phenomena. And like we've said in the book, not only have you got experiencers and abductees, you've got people who are proceeding to use the CE5 techniques. We've got some of these crazy experiences that involve animals. You've got the twins connection. You've got the people seeing enormous swarms of craft in the skies, which are impossible to explain away as an aeroplane or a planet or a reflection of a light from somewhere. They just seem to be focusing on singular craft seen by certain individuals, which for me, when you deal with this topic, it's such a wide-ranging scope of experiences that seems a deliberate attempt to control the narrative, even though, as we've said, disclosure is well past that point, and the cat is out of the bag a long time ago.
Yeah, it's very telling, I think. It's more about what they're not talking about than what they are talking about, because that's where the answers are. Like you said, they've never even mentioned landing cases or anything involving an actual live entity. They'll talk about, a crashed UFO and body, but they won't use those terms. They're calling it, gosh, that's this weird term, UAPs and non-human intelligence. It's just ridiculous, which is why, I'm so driven to put out this information. And talking about, these super fleets or UFO swarms is a good example, because there was an incident which occurred, just jumping into it, if I may, on March 17, 1950 in Farmington, New Mexico, which really should be far more well known than it is. And I talk about this and people are surprised that I'm certainly surprised they've never heard of it. Because this is an event that it should be taught in history books. Because on that day, it was St. Patrick's Day, UFOs showed up over this small town, which had about 3,000 people in the city itself, but, 6,000 in the surrounding areas. And thousands of people watched as, at least 200-300 craft showed up in the morning, daylight hours, and put on what UFO researchers call a display. Because, often UFOs do dart quickly across the sky and they're gone. The average sighting is quite brief, and usually may have 2, 3, or 4 witnesses. And it's usually at night. That's not what happened here. On this day, traffic stopped in the streets. People in the schools came running out. People at work came running out of their place of employment. Everyone's running out of their homes. At least half the town saw this. And by that, I mean police officers, the mayor of the town, the newspaper reporters. Everybody was looking up and watching these metallic craft, with little domes on top. There was some that would dart around each other and circle around and take off. Others were putting at right angles. Some were coming quite low. There was a very large craft that was releasing smaller craft, or so it appeared. So they were, coming right at each other and pulling apart, doing these incredible maneuvers that I think were clearly trying to impress people that, this is something unusual. It's funny because, of course, this did receive considerable publicity at the time, was nationwide news, and the Air Force in particular jumped on it and tried to debunk it and explain it away. I think the most popular explanation that they put forth was that this was a skyhook weather balloon that had shattered into tiny little pieces, and it was all just fluttering to the ground. Now, the witnesses, of course, this is laughable. They said, no. Furthermore, these objects were not only moving from horizon to horizon and doing incredible maneuvers. If it was a skyhook balloon, it would have covered the ground with little pieces of, foil or what have you. And of course, there wasn't any of that. And in fact, the Air Force did show up, according to several of the witnesses, and started interviewing some of them and told them not to talk. Do not talk about it. A few said that they were actually threatened. So the government's mishandling and mistreatment of this is typified, really, in this incident. And it's not only, this went on for a good hour. They went away, and about an hour later, they came back and put on a second display, as if to just leave no doubt whatsoever that this is a real thing. And so I think, honestly, that's the purpose of it. Because as researchers, and I think, a lot of researchers will agree with this, the ETs are putting on what amounts to a really vigorous publicity campaign announcing their presence, whether it's individually or to small groups or to larger groups, such as, over schoolyards or drive-in theaters, as, I wrote about and we talked about. So, yeah, I think this is a good example of that. It's really rare to have these kinds of encounters involving hundreds of objects. I really found, less than a dozen. So that to me is interesting. And there's a couple of more important takeaways. One is that they do have these many craft, which, I mean, makes perfect sense. Because if you look at our own militaries, we have hundreds of planes or ships, or, even a police force can send out, their hundreds of cars, cruisers, to an incident. Well, the ETs also have huge numbers of craft. And we see this in these very rare super swarms. But yeah, just not at all common. It's very strange.
It's interesting for me that they would try and control something like that, Preston, that has, as you say, so many objects, so many witnesses. It seems almost impossible for them to try and do anything with that. And I know when we often look back at that particular period, because I believe that incident was just in the midst of UFO mania that had hit North America in the late 40s, early 50s, that particular incident. Right. And so for me, it's quite interesting that obviously they were still getting to grips with what was going on. I.e., they didn't have a clue what was going on, but they were going to try and control it through force, it would seem, Preston. And it makes you wonder that the kind of conversations that must have been going on in the corridors of power, where they were thinking, oh yeah, what we need to do here is we'll just go around and intimidate everybody and that'll work.
And it's a very effective method. I mean, it worked on the Roswell case, the Roswell crash in New Mexico, which, there was a press release, for Pete's sake, and hundreds upon hundreds of witnesses, and it remained covered up effectively until Stanton Friedman finally interviewed Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer who saw the wreckage, and started piecing together the story, and it slowly dribbled out. And now, of course, it's become one of the top encounters in the world. But yeah, there was a UFO mania going on, and it must have been a huge headache for the Air Force trying to cover this stuff up. But they got good at it. And I think that their method is basically to give it as little attention as possible, clamp down on any media sources, which they did. And we know there's a media cover-up. It's really unfortunate. But, there was a book by a gentleman, I forget his first name, his last name is Hansen, called The Missing Times. Kind of like the New York Times or the LA Times or what have you. It's called The Missing Times because he proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that the people who are in control of the media will not run UFO stories. Every now and then it slips through, particularly in the smaller newspapers, the regional media. But mainstream media very, very rarely will cover a UFO story. Sometimes it just gets so big, whether like Phoenix Lights, for example, or the Hudson Valley Wave or Gulf Breeze or the wave in Belgium. Every now and then an event is just too massive to cover up. But it's been very effective. And to this day, there are lots of intelligent people who are skeptical, who have bought the Air Force line or the military line that all encounters can be explained as hoaxes, hallucinations, and misperceptions, and that there is no evidence, which is ridiculous because there's mountains of evidence. I mean, it's way, way more than most people realize. And the number of encounters is far more numerous than the average person realizes. Most people don't report. So this is a subject that really should be mainstream and should be believed, but isn't, because we're all victims of this cover-up and disinformation campaign put forth with our own tax dollars, by the way. Such a shame.
It is. I mean, one of the other swarm encounters, I think, is from 1965, Preston, and there's a chapter that goes into this sort of off the back of this later in the book. But one of the witnesses is an astronomer. So how you can then turn around to a man whose job it is to look at the sky and tell him he doesn't know what he's doing seems to smack of the arrogance of officialdom there, that they would even believe that they could convince an astronomer that he didn't understand what he was looking at.
Yeah, I did include a chapter on astronomers and UFOs in this book. So thank you for bringing that up, because I was surfing Facebook one day and there's this guy who's posting on every Facebook group about UFOs where are all these astronomers who've seen UFOs? None have seen them, so obviously it's not real. I'm like, oh my gosh, hold on a second. You haven't done your research. Because, in fact, there is a long list of astronomers. And we're talking hundreds, but, a good dozen very high profile, well-known, truly respected astronomers who have had really dramatic encounters. And it goes way back. I mean, Edmund Halley, the discoverer of course, Halley's Comet, was seeing UFOs back in the 1600s. And he described one object that was a vast body bigger than the moon, direct quote, which he triangulated basically at moving about 9,000 miles per hour. And of course, William Herschel, who was the discoverer of the planet Uranus, also saw UFOs. I think one of my favorite cases, I mean, I've got several actually, but there's one guy, I think his name was Robert Shaldak, was working at White Sands. This is in New Mexico. It's a UFO magnet there. We do a lot of rocketry, a lot of atomic research. And this is back in January 25 of 1954. He's on the base monitoring rocket launches. Basically, that was his job as an astronomer. And sees this object blazing across the sky. Now, he's very, very familiar with meteors and shooting stars and all objects. He's an astronomer, so he knows the sky. This is their job. And he can see instantly this is not anything that he can explain as a natural phenomenon. And little did he know, but 17 miles away, there was another military guy, a trained observer, watching the same thing. So once he found that out, they were able to basically triangulate this object, and they realized that, no, this is pretty low. This is not a meteor. It's moving very, thousands of miles per hour. And they were encouraged by another astronomer, Clyde Tombaugh, himself a UFO witness and the discoverer of Pluto. He said, you need to report this to Project Blue Book. And so they did. And they wrote up a report explaining why exactly this is not a meteor. And Project Blue Book officers, with zero investigation and apparently not even interviewing the witnesses, just reading their report, labeled it explained and called it a meteor. So that's a perfect example of I don't even know what you would call it. I'd like to call it, incompetence, but I think it's deliberate. So, yeah. But yeah, Clyde Tombaugh, he discovered Pluto, and earlier in 1949, he and his whole family saw a UFO outside of their home in Las Cruces. It had portholes on it and everything moving across the sky. He became world famous when he discovered Pluto. This generated international headlines. And then when he goes and starts talking about his UFO sighting, crickets. Nothing. Nobody wanted to hear about it. He was infuriated and became very vocal and tried to his darndest to get the mainstream astronomers to take, this subject seriously. And they just wouldn't do it. And he was not alone. There was another guy, Frank Halstead, very well-known astronomer, who on November 1st, 1954, was with his wife on a train going through Death Valley during the day, by the way. And she pointed out, honey, look out the window. What's that? And it was just, less than a mile away, about a quarter mile over this ridge was a huge cigar-shaped craft. Said it looked kind of like a blimp, but there was no gondola. There's no propellers. It's darting around pretty quickly. And very shortly later, joined by another very small metallic disc, moving at right angles, much faster, this second one. And they watched it for a good, 5 or 10 minutes before it darted off. And like Clyde Tombaugh, Frank Halstead became very vocal. He wrote up numerous reports. He tried to generate interest. He said this was an ET craft. No doubt about it. This wasn't made by humans, but just couldn't get anyone to listen. This is how effective this cover-up has been. So what a shame, because there's so many astronomers. In fact, we all know Jacques Vallée, right?
Of course.
He's super well known in this field. 20 books at least, and an astronomer in his own right. Kind of got drawn into this field when he was at an observatory in France and saw his colleagues destroying hard evidence of UFOs. And he's like, well, this is not science. What are they doing? This is ridiculous. And this is what got him interested into the topic. And J. Allen Hynek, of course, the astronomical consultant for Project Blue Book, ended up defecting from Blue Book in absolute disgust of their non-investigation of important UFO events and paying so much attention to anything that was clearly prosaic, Venus or a fireball. That's what they would talk about, not real UFOs. Well, he did a survey with a bunch of astronomers and found out that many of them had seen UFOs but wouldn't talk about it. I said, there's no way I'm talking about this publicly. And several even told him, if I ever saw one, I wouldn't talk about it. So, again, not science. This is absurd to think that this subject is being treated this way. So kudos to Hynek and, the Professor James McDonald, a physicist, and, Leo Sprinkle and Walter Webb and the few scientists of that era who were taking this seriously and tried to get people interested and educated on the subject. But it's like banging your head against a brick wall. You're definitely swimming upstream with this.
I would imagine for Tombaugh, it probably was more frustrating than trying to get people to accept that he discovered what was at that time classed as another planet when he found and proved that Pluto was there out on the outer edges of what we knew as our solar system, Preston. And yet we see this quite often, that they will talk about these strange bodies in the atmosphere. You think of the Halley-Bopp comet and other things, and obviously we've recently gone through the sort of eclipse from most of the North American continent experienced. And you think that if somebody like Tombaugh or Webb or MacDonald and the other such experienced, well-versed, scientifically minded people are trying to push this conversation forward, they must have been perplexed as to why they could talk about the strangest things in the known universe that we could see with our telescopes and our observations. And yet this conversation seemed to be completely non grata. Nobody wanted to discuss it. And yet we're talking about the potential of moons in our solar system where it rains diamond. And we've got enormous volcanoes and storms bigger than Earth on them, Preston. And yet if somebody like Tombaugh sees a strange object in the sky, everybody goes, he's wrong.
I mean, it's absolutely perplexing. I think Dr. James McDonald figured out very early that this was due to the cover-up and really confronted the Air Force on it. And for that matter, J. Allen Hynek, who was trying to extricate himself from all the lies in Blue Book and was very critical of J. Allen Hynek, saying, you need to take this seriously. You know it's real. I know you know it's real. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely feel for people who are trying to study this subject in a serious way, especially back in those days when it wasn't as accepted as it is now, because times have definitely changed. Now, according to several Gallup polls and many surveys, most people do think that this is a real subject. Most people do think our governments are covering up information and know a whole lot more than they're saying. Most people do believe the Roswell crash happened, and our government does have craft in their possession. So, even though Congress is still taking one step sideways and two steps back, this is bringing a lot of new people into the field and raising awareness of this subject. I just feel like sooner or later, the cover-up is going to collapse under the weight of its own lies. It's already at that point. It's basically an open conspiracy. It's no longer possible to keep this secret. So many whistleblowers are coming forth, and our governments, I don't think, will ever willingly disclose. But it's going to happen sooner or later because you can't hide the sky. You can't hide you can hide the truth. You can alter the truth, you can lie about it, and cover it up, but you can never destroy it. This truth is indestructible. It is what it is.
Yeah.
And this is happening. The evidence shows that very clearly. So sooner or later, the truth will come out. And I think we're seeing that.
I mean, we've mentioned him a couple of times, but Donald seems to be one of the, for whatever reason at that particular period of time, Preston, he really got under the skin of officialdom, didn't he? Because obviously he seemed to be really the focus of a real targeted campaign against him, his person, his research, as though they were more so than some other people at that particular period. Preston, I mean, for somebody like you, when you're looking back at some of these luminaries that were battling against Project Blue Book and the nonsensical explanations they were putting forward in some cases, why do you think MacDonald was targeted for such a vitriolic campaign? Because essentially it took its toll on him, sadly, more than most people. I know there are stories and anecdotal evidence of certain witnesses and other lesser-known UFO investigators being intimidated, but for me, MacDonald's one of the saddest cases because they drove him to take his own life, didn't they?
Yeah, it's very sad. But you know what? I think one of the reasons is he was unimpeachable. He had a resume that you couldn't touch. He was very well respected. He's a true scientist. And when that, he is a thorn in their side, because, he would, find a UFO case and then said, he contacted them about a specific event over Malmstrom Air Force Base, where there was numerous officers who saw UFOs. They were coming in for a landing, and Blue Book said, "Oh, we have no information on this." So what did MacDonald do? He went to each witnesses, interviewed them all, wrote up a 60-page report, and sent it to Project Blue Book. Said, "Here, now you have the file," which they already had. They were lying about it.
Yeah.
But now they couldn't lie. So this is how, ambitious he was. And God bless him, he was going to make sure the truth came out. And he's a true hero in my eyes. As are Jim and Coral Lorenzen of APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, which was the first citizen UFO group of any real influence, who also got infiltrated by the CIA. They caught them red-handed. One of their, quote, field investigators was sending out, dossiers of everything that they were doing. And they caught him red-handed. And this is actually pretty normal for UFO groups. NICAP, the National Investigative Committee of Aerial Phenomena, was basically headed by Donald Kehoe, another true hero, an absolute thorn in the side of the Air Force. NICAP got infiltrated ultimately by intelligence officers, and it collapsed. It became a very ineffective organization. But boy, Kehoe, he did such good work. I love his books. I mean, he was on TV once and started to talk, and they blacked him out, pulled him offline. It's like such blatant cover-up. It's ridiculous. But yeah, thanks to Kehoe and MacDonald and the Lorenzens and really just a handful of people for that era, we would not be talking about this subject in the way we are today.
It's interesting as well that in recent years there's a couple of characters that are sort of positioning themselves as if they've come across from the dark side, as it were, Preston. I'll not give them any more oxygen of publicity because I'm very dubious, having seen both of them interviewed several years ago, and seem to be quite gleeful in the fact that they sent one particular UFO witness mad by breaking into his home and stealing footage and planting strange things in his house and moving things around, to the point that, once again, we have another individual who is driven to taking his own life by the actions of external agencies. I find it incredible that anybody in the UFO field would want to associate with such a gentleman who seemed to be quite gleeful about the games he'd play with UFO witnesses and turning investigators against each other and all sorts. And yet here we are, 2024, we're supposed to believe that this particular person has seen the light, as it were.
Yeah, I am super distrustful of anyone who's coming from intelligence circles and is a self-admitted disinformation agent. Really? I'm supposed to believe you now? There are absolutely very popular researchers, and I'll put that in quote, researchers, in this field, and for that matter, contactees, again in quotes, who claim to be investigating this or having actual contact, and I don't think for 1 second they are. I think they're disinformation agents, and you can see this because they're putting forth nonsensical stories and absolutely outrageous claims. Some of the stuff that's in this field just makes my eyes roll back in my head. Like, who do you think you are? What evidence do you have for this? There's a really vigorous campaign to paint ETs in a negative light. And I actually bought into that when I got involved in this field. I'm like, oh, this is horrific. But I pretty quickly understood what was going on here and really took an objective look. I had to take a step back and really throw away any prior beliefs I had and rely on my own research and see, what other researchers I could trust out there, because there are good researchers. I love Barbara Lamb. I think Timothy Good does a good job, and Philip Mantle. I mean, there's some good researchers for sure. Linda Zimmerman, Michael Schratt. Well, some of them know, and I won't name names. I'll name a couple who have passed on. Philip Klass, he called himself a researcher. He's a debunker. And of course, Donald Menzel, the so-called astronomer who vigorously debunked UFOs. We now know he knew they were real. So, yeah, people very popular in this field right now who, go to conventions and draw an audience and are putting out books and contactees as well. I don't believe them for a second. It's real unfortunate that there are people in this field who are just muddying the waters.
Well, Klass is a prime example, because having heard some of his older interviews in the 80s and 90s, and basically he seemed to pop up whenever there was a case that made the news, Preston. He seemed to be on speed dial for the television networks, it would seem, and would appear on every show, especially in the 90s, arguing with Stanton Friedman quite a lot of the time. And he always tried to put himself forward as a skeptic who just needed the real proof, and he didn't have any issues or anything to hide. And then when he passed away, his FBI file got released. And so we know everything he ever said was a complete lie, because he was a plant.
Yeah, it's what other field of science do you bring on a person to bash the researcher and the witness? That's not science. I mean, it just isn't. And it's not a balanced viewpoint, which is the sort of farce that they're putting forth. Like, oh, we need to hear the other side. There's no other side when you're basically attacking a person's research. This doesn't happen in any other field of research, really. So it's unacceptable. There's no excuse. It's disingenuous. It just makes me cringe when I hear organizations like NASA saying, well, we're forming a study group and we're going to look into this, and we don't have enough evidence right now. I'm like, well, hold on a second. How many satellites are surrounding our planet? It's black if you look at a map of Earth. And we know satellites can basically read the letters on a postage stamp. And you're telling me you don't have evidence. That's disingenuous. Or ARROW. Gosh, let me see if I can remember the acronym. Aldename Anomaly Reconnaissance Office, which basically said the same thing. We don't have enough evidence. Oh, sure you don't. How many thousands of landing trace cases are? Pick up a UFO book, for Pete's sake. I'll have one. I have one right here. I'll give it to you. Free of charge. It's infuriating.
I think the one chapter that made me smile a lot, Preston, because it brought back a lot of memories of being a younger person growing up. And I think it's one of those aspects of popular entertainment that sometimes we seem to be very comfortable with. And it's amazing when you think about it, how many sitcoms from all walks of life, and I would imagine this applies to every country in the modern era, I would suspect, where popular shows will suddenly randomly throw in an alien episode for whatever reason. My first memory of this kind of thing happening as a child was obviously seeing Mork's Arrival on Happy Days, because I think a lot of people forget that Mork and Mindy didn't start as Mork and Mindy. Mork was an additional character who turns up in an episode of Happy Days to try and learn about humans in the 1950s.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm a huge fan of the sitcoms. I love comedy. And I always kind of laughed at these UFO stories until I became a UFO researcher and I started to get offended. I'm like, hey, wait a second. Because I noticed a really disturbing pattern, because it does appear. I mean, you name a sitcom, more than likely they've had a UFO episode. Whether it's I Love Lucy or My Three Sons or Green Acres, Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, all of Golden Girls, Married with Children. I found well over 24 just American sitcoms. I wish I knew more about, British sitcoms and others in other countries, because I'm sure that this same pattern is there. But what I noticed was really upsetting is that the least reliable character, the one who's basically the idiot or the youngest or the oldest or the least reliable, that's the one who sees the UFO in every single episode. So that is, I think, a reflection on how this subject is being treated in, society. Thankfully, there is a sort of progression towards this being accepted, because the earlier episodes, it was always a complete hoax. Whenever early sitcom, it wasn't a real thing. It was a hoax. It was military. It was a shooting star. It's not real. But as time went on, the episodes would usually end on a mysterious note where an actual genuine UFO shows up and darts off. And they leave it with a real positive note that this is real and should be taken seriously. But I have yet to see a single episode where the smart character, or the straight man, is the one who sees the UFO. It's always the guy on drugs, the one who's drinking, the tiny little kid who is so naive and ignorant. Like Golden Girls, for example, Betty White played Rose, who was, ditzy. Let's face it, she couldn't tell, one thing from the other. She did it beautifully. It's so funny because Betty White was actually a huge UFO believer, and talked about it on her. She did a talk show for a while, and talked about UFOs. So I thought that was super interesting. And pretty disturbing how it's treated.
Didn't she have Donald Kehoe on her show in the 50s?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, who doesn't love Betty White? We all love her. And I wish she had been more vocal about. I wonder sometimes if she was a contactee, honestly. She never talked about seeing anything, but I know there's a lot of famous people out there who are contactees, and a lot of them are coming forth now. Certainly John Lennon and Miley Cyrus and Demi Lovato and the Moody Blues, and a lot of people who are quite famous have seen UFOs.
Well, as we mentioned earlier on, the Phoenix Light case. Obviously, one of the most famous celebrity witnesses ever is Kurt Russell, who saw the lights when he was flying his plane and thought it was so strange he reported it. Because I remember seeing him, he was on British television here, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. I'm not sure if he was doing the press for either the Hateful Eight or the Guardians of the Galaxy 2, Preston. I'm not sure. It was one of those two films. And so he was doing the British chat show circuit. And they did something about the Phoenix Lights completely randomly. I don't think they realised. Well, that's what we're told anyway. You never know. Somebody in the production team may have had an inkling about this. And they started talking about it. And they just said to him, oh, so what do you think? He said, well, I know it's real because I'm the guy I'm the pilot that reported it. And they were like, what? So he seems very comfortable talking about it. And it's obviously done his career no damage at all, which is often the reason. And you see, as we were saying about sitcom characters, Preston, it's always the stupid one, the drunk one, the one that can't be trusted. And you see this when celebrities come forward these days with their experiences. They're always brushed off as being high on drugs. Yeah,
and it's funny because there's a lot of them, and God bless them for coming forward, because I think they know that this is still a pretty hostile environment. Certainly it is for politicians, who I think are much more reluctant to step forward. And there's a lot of them. I mean, we saw this in the congressional hearings. One of the senators was talking, saying, yeah, there is a cover-up. And in fact, several of us here have seen UFOs, and I'm not going to name names. I almost threw a shoe at the TV when he said that. Because I'm like, wait a second. You want truth and transparency? Name names. Tell us. Come on. Just talk about it up front. Mm-hmm. And, I have to, respect the fact that they don't want to because they need their jobs. Many people have told me, please don't use my name. This could affect my career. We know police officers have been passed over for promotion because of this. Well, look at Alan Godfrey, who's, of course, well known in England or the UK for having basically been driven out of the police force due to his own encounter. So it's a real shame, because if this was treated with more seriousness, we would have 100 times the number of cases documented than we have now. Easily 100 more, which would be close to 100 million. Can you imagine? We've got 8 billion people on this planet, and according to many surveys, about 20% of people, I think it's higher than that, but have had a direct encounter of some kind. So that's a lot of people.
It certainly is. Alan's sighting is one very close to my heart because he's from Yorkshire, as I am, Preston.
Oh, wow.
And I've been to Todmorden. So I've been where he had his sighting. I've walked around the town. I've been to where they found the cows. I had a right little wander about. And Todmorden has a reputation. It's even got a regular UFO group there. It's become a hub for sort of alternative lifestyles. There's a big music scene there. They've got a wonderful folklore centre there where they have regular talks on all kinds of wonderful things. I know Dr. David Clark was there recently talking about UFOs and photos. So it's really embraced Alan's story. And these days, Alan in the area is very much held up as a local celebrity by the townsfolk and clearly well respected from everybody. I know he did his book in conjunction with Jenny Randall's a few years ago as well. But it's interesting when you look at how Alan was treated in 1980 and, like you say, his subsequent pushing out of the police force to now the town I would suggest if you ask the people who are involved in the local scene there, they would consider themselves that Yorkshire's hotspot for UFOs, because Alan's sightings are the tip of the iceberg there.
Yeah, to hand it over to Alan. It's such a shame because his experience, while he was a single witness to this UFO, turns out he wasn't. There was a bunch of reports that night, and officers came over, and the UFO was hovering. It was a rainy day, and the cement was dry.
Yep.
There was all these evidence to support his story, and still he got ridiculed from fellow officers and got pushback from his superiors, which was absolutely, almost hypocritical, not warranted for sure.
Yeah.
He should have been absolutely treated with respect. And it's such a shame that they took away his police car, gave him a bicycle.
Yeah.
That's shameful. How dare you? There's going to be karma to pay for a lot of the folks who are on the wrong side of history with this. Because that's just unfair.
Yeah. Yeah. And Alan's, I think the week before as well, there was an incident where 3 officers saw a blue light streaking across the town. So there was clearly a lot going on in that town at that particular time. And it's continued to this day, because I obviously follow them quite a lot, and I follow the folklore centre on social media. So I'm aware of that place. Like I say, it's a lovely place. If you're ever in England, I recommend you take a trip there, Preston. It's not far from Manchester. It's fairly easy to get to for non-locals. It's a lovely place, but it is surprising, like you say. And I suppose Alan's case is one of those examples where, as we were talking about astronomers, how relevant a character do they need to be for their experience and their story to be believed? If we're going to dismiss the experiences of astronomers and people who deal with strange things in space, and police officers who, if he'd seen somebody shoplifting a loaf of bread from the local supermarket and he got a description of them, they'd believe him and arrest that person. They wouldn't say, "Oh, I think you're a bit tired, Alan," or "Perhaps you've been on the night shift too long," would they?
Exactly, which makes you wonder just how many police officers, we know this to be true. If you're in a position of any authority or it does, threaten your reputation or your job, you're not going to talk about it. So there very well could have been many other people of very high caliber, in terms of career, who saw stuff going on and could have corroborated his story and the stories of many other people for that matter. So Yeah, it's a real shame. I mean, we are literally, I've said it before, but we're literally all victims of this UFO cover-up. There should not be any skepticism because we've been able to gather enough evidence in terms of landing traces and medical evidence, healings, the animal reactions, the electromagnetic disturbances, implant removal cases. I mean, we have enough physical evidence. There's something called angel hair. Not a lot of people know about it, but this is a substance kind of cotton candy-like in appearance, but it is a byproduct apparently of the plasma fields surrounding UFOs interacting with our atmosphere and creates this substance which has been put in a scientific laboratory and studied, and it's not naturally forming. It's absolutely in conjunction with UFO encounters. Enough, there's a good 100 cases where people have seen this happen. It's great evidence, and almost nobody knows about it. I mean, skeptics, I understand skeptics because I was one, but you stick your head in the sand. It's basically what you're doing. If you're a skeptic, you're probably not examining the evidence, because if you do, and you can objectively examine it and basically throw away your preconceptions, I just don't see how you cannot come away convinced that there is absolute reality to all of this.
I know we were talking about sitcoms there. One of the things that's always struck me as well, Preston, is when a serious drama or a program of that nature takes a strange turn occasionally. Dynasty in the 1980s is very famous for creating one of the strangest plot lines, I think, even in the world of soap operas, Preston. I don't think anybody expected them to introduce a UFO encounter and abduction for one of their major characters. With the things that you've looked at and some of the stranger things, is that a real sort of singular example of a drama using UFOs as a storyline, rather than, without wishing to sound churlish, a sitcom you could kind of see a jokey scenario or a situation, maybe with a twist at the end, involving UFOs or aliens or whatever. And we've had numerous sitcoms involving aliens. I mean, Alf, the cat-eating alien, is probably the most famous example of a major program. It was a very popular show in the 80s, which is quite odd when you think about the fact most of the time he was trying to eat the cats in the neighbourhood all the time. But Dynasty, even for me as a young person, I thought, what on earth's going on here? This is very odd.
I think it was groundbreaking. They were, as far as I know, really the first major soap opera, at least, to cover this in a serious way. And a lot of dramas won't touch it. All shows do have their little theme, whether, it's, Grey's Anatomy or CSI or anything. They're not touching the UFO subject, which is a shame because I think it's a very interesting topic. And we know it's super popular. There's been studies on, the popularity of this subject, and it's way high. People are very, very interested in this. It's one of the most searched topics on the internet. So there's lots of room here for, people who are basically interested in the bottom line of money to draw in viewers. But yeah, you just don't see it in dramas. I'm not a huge fan of dramas. Cops and guns and killing. My friend always called it, after 9 or 10 o'clock, everything on TV is about murder. And, he's right. I think that's deliberate, honestly, because we do see a sort of campaign of divisiveness and basically hatred and putting forth negativity. So, I just can't. I don't have any real interest in those kind of television programs. That's just me. But yeah, I wish that this was a subject which would find its way into more programs. Thankfully, it is very popular in science fiction movies. That's one of the top 10 movies in terms of grossing dollars. A good number of them do feature extraterrestrials. And certainly it's a very, very popular trope in science fiction. And it's all over advertising. I mean, you name it. It's in video games everywhere. So this subject is basically saturating our culture at this point. You can buy UFO ice cream bars and UFO candies. And you name it, there's a UFO theme to it. So that, I think, is really interesting and reflects how truly this is a subject whose time has come. This is not going to go away. People will never just forget about UFOs because it speaks so loudly to who we are and our place in this universe. And it's really kind of the next step to exploring what is out there. It's the final frontier, as Star Trek often says.
Yeah.
I think we have a busy universe out there, and it's time we recognize that.
Well, as we said earlier, some of these chapters are quite amusing. They're all very interesting, Preston. But Chapter 9, about people's dogs having encounters. And I think you kind of lead us into this with that wonderful story. I think it's a chap called Everett who saw these strange people stood next to a UFO who tried to steal a dog, and the dog bit one of them. And they didn't like that, so they buggered off. It is interesting because I think when we talk about extraterrestrials, UFOs, contact, abductions, there seems to be very few cases where we've got other animals and creatures involved, Preston. I find it very hard to believe that you would stumble across stories about aliens stealing cats, but I wouldn't put it past you and your diligent research to find out that there may be a case involving an alien and a cat, and you're probably going to make me look very silly by pulling one from your head in a moment. But often when we talk about extraterrestrial encounters with animals, we perceive the best example I would suggest is probably cattle mutilations, because depending where you're coming from, for some people that's 100% cast iron, cannot be disproved. They believe that is alien experimentation on livestock, for better or for worse, Preston, wherever you want to look at it. And some people think that is the only explanation there. And yet you would think in the whole scheme of things that man's best friend, the one that's usually by our side more often than not, there would be encounters. So not that I was expecting it, but I was very surprised to see how many rather worrying stories there are. And I must admit, since I've read your book, Preston, whenever I take my dog for a late night stroll to relieve himself, shall we say, I'm often finding myself looking to the sky thanks to you.
All right. Well, I think that's a good thing to do because we need to be aware of what's going on. But let me just backpedal a little bit, if I may, on cattle mutilations, because I did have to look into this when I wrote UFOs over New Mexico and UFOs over Colorado. And it's not a subject I really am drawn towards because it is quite grim. But I have to tell you, I was surprised to find that a good number of the leading researchers in this area said, no, this is not being done by ETs. This is our own government who is doing this. And that was surprising to me. But as I looked into it, I kind of came to the same conclusion. Remember, we have reverse engineered ET technology, and they can basically stage an ET encounter and make you think it's ET when it's not. I think this is part of the, quote, false flag to paint ETs in a negative light. And no, I don't think ETs are doing this. And, I got really good confirmation of this when I interviewed a contactee by the name of Dolly Safran, who's my favorite contactee because she's fully conscious. She's going on board. She doesn't have fear. She's not using hypnosis. She's had thousands of encounters, really. And she basically came forward because she was so infuriated about how this whole subject is being misrepresented. She's like, no, they do not do cattle mutilations. It's not true. And if you look into that and look at, researchers like Gabe Valdez, he was really the go-to guy for years. He ultimately concluded it was government and that our own government's going to have to answer to this. So I just wanted to put that forth.
Oh, no. I completely chime with you, Preston. Having spoken with Christopher O'Brien and read his incredible book going on some of the things that were going on in the valleys out there from the 70s onwards, and having seen certain things and looked deeper into it, for me, there's something far more nefarious going on there than simply, as you say, a false flag operation trying to point this to the skies, when I think that the perpetrators are far closer to home than we could even contemplate.
Yeah, those are the folks I'm worried about, is the secret government, the cabal, the one percenters. They know who they are. I think we've already kind of figured it out, how they've managed to, enslave humanity and take all the wealth. That's kind of beyond me. I don't understand that. But it's an unfortunate situation. I'm not happy about it because they're making people actually believe that ETs are a threat. And the only ET threat is to them and their power structure and their control over the narrative and their control over humanity. ETs are not here to take over. It's ridiculous. When someone's taken on board, they're more likely to be healed than anything. They're going to be shown the craft, given a tour, be warned against nuclear proliferation and wars and greed and corruption and destruction of the environment. They're going to be taught how to use psychic abilities like telepathy or astral projection or healing. That is what the contact experience is all about. So to hear this being so badly misrepresented, it's a travesty because it's not true. Yeah, ETs are collecting genetic material, sure. They're bringing up all kinds of animals on board, actually. And I think it's largely an effort to preserve species and protect species, because we know we're losing species on a practically daily basis. It's, life here on Earth. We're mistreating our planet very badly. And this has been the number one message from ETs from the 1950s onward. Whether it's grays or praying mantids or human looking or short little blue guys or tall whites or strange humanoids of all types are saying the same darn thing. So I think this is one of the chapters in the book, actually. I think the most important chapter is I think I called it You Were Warned.
Yes.
Because it is something that's super important. And almost every major researcher who is focused on onboard experiences has multiple cases of these, where ETs are warning us about how we treat each other and our planet. I mean, it's unsustainable. We are already at the path of no return in terms of recovering our own environment. So we're looking at some tough times ahead because of how badly we've treated our environment. That and other things are going on, certainly,
yeah.
Which the ETs are warning us about. But yeah, I mean, this is why I like doing this research, because the truth hurts sometimes, but people deserve to know. I'd much rather know what's going to happen or get, the information out there than wallow in complete ignorance and be blindsided by stuff coming at you that you had no idea about.
I think as well, it's interesting when you look at the warnings chapter, because I think for people of a skeptical standpoint or who view these encounters or experiences in a more negative light, Preston, they would often try and paint these as throwbacks to some of the contactees in the 1950s who were, once again, came under the radar of the CIA and the FBI, because a lot of what these aliens were telling these alleged contactees seemed very similar to communism, about everybody getting on and sharing everything and being a community rather than allowing people to be in charge. And I think they were more concerned that perhaps the aliens weren't aliens, they were Russians, I think, at that particular time, which is also a very interesting aspect, that once you drill into it, when they were sort of infiltrating people like Adamski, regardless of the real facts of what some of these contactees were saying and the experiences they were sharing, there was clearly a deep concern in the corridors of power about the messages that were being relayed to people back in those heady days of the 50s. And then when you look at some of the big reports, such as Ariel, the majority of the witnesses there who talk about the messages they were relayed seem to be about environmental awareness, the damage we were causing to the planet. And you can see that in certain other cases. It goes on still with contactees and abductions, doesn't it? That people will have these messages of environmental destruction beamed into their minds or expressed to them in some form or other.
I think this has caused a lot of debate and concern among researchers. And it's funny to see them grappling with this, because some are saying, well, I think they're just giving these messages to test the emotions of the witness. I'm like, well, okay, that's kind of an odd thing to say, because it is quite emotional for these witnesses to view scenes of nuclear destruction and what have you. And then someone will say, oh, they're just using scare tactics to try to get you on the right path before it's too late, which is another interesting theory, but purely speculative. And the vast majority of people who actually have the experience and who would know better than someone who's had the experience feel that these are actually accurate predictions. Warnings, very specific. So it kind of amuses me a little bit in a sad way to think that, some researchers are sort of dismissing this as, emotional testing or something. No. ETs have been warning about this for a very long time, and we're seeing everything they warned about actually happening right now. So I think it behooves us to take these warnings 100% seriously, because, we are seeing it come true. And it's across the board. People do kind of, I think today, look at the 1950 contactee era with some derision and like, oh, perhaps these guys were hoaxers like Adamski, who certainly put forth some outrageous claims. But some of these contactees, I think, were absolutely legit. I mean, people are taking a second look at Adamski and some of his encounters. And I have to tell you, his first encounter in Desert Center did have 4 witnesses who stuck by their story to the day they died, so that they saw Adamski and the landed craft and the humanoid and the whole meeting from a short distance away. So he does have corroborating witnesses. But people like, Truman Bethram and Daniel Fry and Howard Menger, I mean, there might be absolute truth to their story, but they were ridiculed mercilessly because the messages they were receiving were such in direct conflict with what our own, quote, secret government was trying to cover up. They love nuclear weapons. They don't have our best interests in mind. They just don't. And the ETs, I think, were trying very hard and still are to counteract that. And that's why that's the driving force behind the cover-up. That's why when someone does have a lot of good evidence or excellent photographs, or, someone like Bob Lazar, who I think is telling the truth, honestly, comes under such vicious attack. Because this is someone who has information that could change the narrative and move it in the right direction. And that's the last thing the folks behind the cover-up want.
I think it is interesting, like you say, because when you look at that particular era where they were putting these first sort of wave of contactees under duress and ridiculing them whenever they could, this is an era where people were advertising cigarettes as good for your health, Preston. So,
right.
The last thing you want is somebody from another planet coming saying, stop using nuclear weapons, quit smoking and eat more vegetables. They'd be like, what's going on here?
They do say that. I've got a couple of cases where people were pulled on board and basically told, you need to stop smoking cigarettes. Jim Sparks, they pulled this tar from his lungs. They said, this is our gift to you. It was a smelly substance in a jar. And he's like, what's this? They said, we pulled this from your lungs. You need to stop smoking. I know of another case that's exactly the same in almost all of its particulars. Really, only the shape of the container is different.
Yeah.
Another guy was told, you need to stop smoking marijuana. This is not the life we had planned for you. Another contactee was told, you're eating way too many fatty foods. This is not good for you. Another was told, stop drinking Diet Coke. It's damaging your liver. And they showed it to her in a hologram, a living hologram. There were black spots all over it. They had cured her of kidney disease. Said, look, your kidneys are fine, but your liver is not healthy. Stop drinking Diet Coke. It's not good for you. So they will dispense, dietary advice and lifestyle advice. Get more exercise. There was one guy who was ready to commit suicide. ETs showed up and basically talked him out of it. So they will help people mentally as well who have some depression issues or what have you.
It fascinates me sometimes because when we look at these, the Jim Sparks story has always made me chuckle because it's such a random. If somebody's going to make a story up like that, Preston, that's the kind of thing where you think, why would you make something like that? Because that sounds ridiculous, and therefore you can only come to two conclusions with an experience like that. It's either 100% true or it's just made up. But why would you make it up? Because often the people, as we were referring to earlier, who try to insert themselves into this field or relay stories or wherever, they're either rehashing old stories that any decent researcher or investigator will be aware of and will be able to spot the parallels of certain stories, or they've basically regurgitated a classic tale in their version of it. Or they'll just create such a weird an unusual situation. It goes beyond the realms of comprehension because it's too far-fetched if there could be such a thing. Even though I know we're talking about strange encounters and people having tar taken out their lungs, that's clearly grounded in a basis of fact, whereas often these fake stories and experiences, you can spot a hoax from quite a long distance away these days, I think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's some people who are saying things that are just scientifically impossible. Cannot happen. You know, being age regressed and fighting super soldier reptilians on Mars. No. You can't live on Mars. There's no magnetic field. You would die. You would be fried in a day. It's not going to happen. And yet people are putting forth these absolutely absurd stories about this. So, some of these may be absolute innocent victims of basically mind control programs, MyLabs, which is a real thing. And we know our own governments have done vast amounts of research into the whole MK Ultra programs using drugs and hypnosis and scare tactics and psychotronic technology that we really have no idea about. We're only skimming the surface of what we know, because most of technology that we see anyway is 50, 100 years behind what is in military hands. And frankly, they have a lot more than that because of the ET tech. It's a huge concern because MyLabs is really what's muddying the waters more than anything in terms of people perceiving this as a negative phenomenon. And I'm sticking to my guns here because having interviewed so many people who've had contact, I can tell you that while it may be very frightening for people, largely because we have been trained to be frightened. I mean, let's face it, fear of death is a guiding force among our lives, and we have been trained to be afraid of everything, anything different. Fear, fear, fear. That's what the news is really all about. So yeah, people are victims of that and will have a UFO experience and be essentially traumatized. But once they realize, oh my gosh, the ETs are saying, don't be afraid. Why am I so afraid? That's the first thing they always tell people. You know, we're not here to harm you. You're fine. Relax. Don't be afraid. No harm will come to you. And they'll pull you on board. And basically, this is when, it's very scary for people when they're being physically examined. And that's the worst I hear. I don't have any cases of people being, tortured and sadistic behavior and ETs trying to hurt you. But it can be very uncomfortable and really scary for people. But ultimately, especially those who have repeated contacts, they ultimately come to realize, I'm still here. I'm coming back. I've woken up, got all these psychic abilities. They've taught me all this stuff. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I would say 80 to 90% of people ultimately reach that. Some don't. They just have such trauma that they're like, I'm not going to explore this. I'm shelving this. It's going into a little box in my head, and I'm not going to talk about it. I don't like it. And I absolutely 100% respect that. It's their life. It's their experience. I'm not here to say, this didn't happen to you, because it did. That was their experience.
Yeah.
If someone experienced a negative encounter and felt it was negative, well, I have nothing but sympathy for you and understanding, and will do my best to help you through it, because that is my major goal. I get contacted all the time from people who are not wanting to be interviewed so much as they just have a few questions.
Yeah.
Or, they need a shoulder, someone, an ear, someone to bounce some ideas on and basically get talked through their experience so they can figure out what's going on with them. But no, they're not here to hurt us. It's absurd. They've been around forever, since well before recorded history. So, they're not here to hurt us or take over. I think even a brief look at the vast amount of cases out there will show this.
Well, one would suggest as well, Preston, with the abilities and technology that they have, it wouldn't be very difficult I mean, here, people in the same country don't get on. Never mind coming together to defend themselves against anybody coming from outside of our atmosphere. So I'm often being perplexed by people who say they're coming to take us over. If they've got the ability to fly over here with craft that can't be spotted on our defence systems, and they can go in and out of water, and they can come and see people and beam messages into people, if they had nefarious plans for us, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I don't think either of us would be here, would we?
Yeah. Well, this is exactly what Paul Hynek says. He says, if they were hostile, we would know it by now. I think that's absolutely true. But we have a tendency to view things through the lens of our own belief system. Fear plays a powerful role as well. And I think we're basically inserting our own cultural values or overlaying them onto these ETs, because we are the ones who commit mass genocide. We're the ones who lie, cheat, and steal. We are the ones who treat each other, or mistreat, I should say, so badly. And so I kind of understand it. But if you just look at the onboard encounter objectively, you can see it's absolutely a benevolent experience. I mean, they're trying so hard to wake people up to their own psychic abilities and let us know that we are immortal beings. And we can do all these wonderful things, and you need to stop polluting your planet and fighting each other. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Many contactees have asked, why don't you just come and take over? You could do a much better job. And they said, no, we can't do that. You know, we have to respect your karma. They'll use that word. You know, we have to respect your free will. That's another word they'll use specifically. We've made our own bed. We have to lie in it. We've caused our own problems. You know, people say, well, why didn't they just stop Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, you know what? We learned a really brutal lesson from that. And as every parent knows, every child at some point is going to touch the hot stove and burn themselves. And there's no way they're going to learn what hot is until they do that. And it's unfortunate, you know, I think they do intervene to the point when it might cause an existential crisis, but we can't rely on that. You know, look at what happened in Malmstrom. They came down and shut down all the nuclear-tipped missiles. They didn't take them away. They didn't destroy them. They could have. They basically just shut them down. And I think couldn't be more clear of a warning saying you're on the wrong path here. But it wasn't, you know, a brutal takeover intervention. They're not going to do that. It's up to us to solve our own problems.
Absolutely. I think that's clear. I mean, I'm sometimes surprised that train of thought in regards to extraterrestrials is still permeating certain corners of ufology, Preston, because you only have to look at the last 80 years and the conflicts and the bombs and the testing to realise that, well, they're not going to just come and clear everything up for us. I think, like you say, they're wanting to get to a point, if we are to believe that these messages are genuine and what they're trying to achieve, and this is what they want us as a population to do, is to grow as one and leave our damaging and environmentally destructive past behind us. But we have to do it under our own free will. They can't just turn up with a magic wand and take everything away, because if that was the point, they could have done it countless times over the last few decades. And as you refer to there, Hiroshima and Nagasaki as prime examples. They haven't intervened in any major conflict, despite certain loose and flimsy anecdotal evidence about certain incidents during times of conflict. Clearly, they want us to achieve harmony through our means.
Clear. And I'm glad. You know, no one wants to have their life led by somebody else. It's infuriating. We all need to learn to make our own decisions and, you know, suffer the consequences of our choices. And we're absolutely seeing that now. I do wish that we had more, you know, better ways to sort of get at these 1%ers or the cabal, because they pulled a number over all humanity, and we're at the point now where it's very difficult to extricate ourselves from the lies and the deceit, and the divisiveness, and the unequal distribution of wealth. I don't know how we can overcome it. It's going to take everybody all at once to say enough is enough. And I'm an optimist by nature. You know, I'm an idealist. I like to look at the best humanity has to offer. And I think we could do it. Do I think we will? As a realist, no. I honestly think ultimately it's going to take us a lifetime of learning. And I don't know that Earth has a super bright future at this point because of, just the evil and morass that's overtaking us.
Yes. Sadly, there seems to be two things we're very good at, and that's inventing new ways to kill each other and new ways to pollute the planet, sadly.
Yes, it's a talent.
Of some description, yeah. Well, it's another incredible collection. I always say this whenever I read one of your books, that you will discover your new favourite UFO or extraterrestrial case in this. And like I say, there's more than one, as normal in your books, Preston, that's given me pause for thought, or I've read 3 or 4 times and just thought, wow, that's incredible. Or, as I said about the alien and dog chapter, made me a little bit worried every time I go out for a walk with my dog these days. So what's next for you? What's next in the pipeline? Because one of the things we can always almost set our watches to, Preston, is your prolific output, my friend. So what are you working on currently, and what's due next from you?
Oh, I'm keeping busy. Of course, I've got my YouTube channel, which I'm putting out a lot of my research. I do a weekly podcast with Dolly Safran.
Yes.
Subject of my book Symmetry, called The Light Gate, airs Monday evening, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm going to put out Symmetry 2, which continues where Symmetry left off, all about Dolly Safran's experiences. That's probably the next book. But I want to put out one about out-of-body experiences, because that's a subject that's very dear to my heart.
Mm-hmm.
I've already written one book about my own experiences with that, and another one is in the works, and some other stuff on supernatural stuff. And I love looking at all aspects of UFOs and the paranormal, because they're all connected in some way. So yeah, I've got a lot of irons in the fire, and I'm pretty excited about it. But yeah, Symmetry, I think, is going to be the next big project. I'm hoping to get that done before year's end.
Fabulous. I know some people will be eagerly awaiting more installments and information in regards to Dolly's life and her experiences, Preston, so no doubt people will be eagerly awaiting that. Where can everybody find you online, follow your YouTube channel, and get hold of this book and many of your previous issues as well?
I'm pretty much super easy to find on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Go to YouTube, punch my name in, it'll take you to my channel. You can buy my books on Amazon, of course, and Barnes & Noble and other online retailers. I always love hearing from people. You can find my website also by punching my name in. It's prestondennett.weebly.com, and you can contact me through my website or read excerpts from my books and follow my stuff on Facebook as well. So yeah, thanks, Paul, for giving me the opportunity to talk about these subjects. I find it not only interesting, but I think it's really important. I really do. People deserve to know what's going on, because our governments are not going to tell us. If you want to know the truth, don't look to them. Look to the contactees, because everything we know about UFOs is coming from them, not from our governments.
Absolutely. Well, as always, when I've spoken with you, Preston, I always feel more enlightened and more knowledgeable about this particular subject. So, as always, thank you for fitting me in. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me again. And I hope we speak again in the near future. Take care.
Thank you, Paul.